Snow fell in slow, deliberate spirals over the small harbor town of Windermere, Maine, wrapping its cobblestone streets in a muffled hush. Christmas lights flickered from every shop window, their colors reflecting on the wet pavement like broken jewels. Inside Harlan's coffee house, the air was warm, carrying the mingled scents of roasted bean cinnamon and the faint brine from the nearby docks. The place was busy for a Wednesday night. Locals wrapped in wool scarves, fishermen in heavy coats, and a few tourists escaping the cold. Clara Emerson stood on the small wooden stage at the back, her hands lightly gripping the microphone. She wasn't dressed for show, just a worn burgundy sweater and dark jeans, but her voice didn't need costumes. It was soft at first, like the first brush of snow against your cheek, then rose with a quiet power that drew every wandering eye in the café. She sang an old folk ballad her mother had taught her, one about leaving and longing about waiting at a shore for someone who might never return. Her voice carried the weight of winters she was too young to have lived yet somehow understood. Near the far corner, in the dimmest pool of light, a man sat alone. His coat was thick but frayed at the cuffs. A wool cap shadowed his face, and his hands were wrapped around a mug he didn't drink from. He wasn't like the other customers. He didn't check his phone, didn't glance toward the counter. He just listened. When Clara hit the high note, his gaze dropped to the table, as though the sound had struck something inside him he wasn't ready to face. His fingers tightened on the mug. The cafe around him blurred the clinking of cups and low chatter dissolving until all that was left was her voice. Clara noticed him between verses, noticing how still he was, how his eyes seemed fixed somewhere far away, even as he stared into the wood grain of the table. There was something in his stillness that pulled at her, though she couldn't have said why. When the last chord faded, the room broke into warm applause. She gave a shy smile, murmured a thank you, and stepped down from the stage. The man in the corner didn't clap. He just sat there, unmoving, his gaze finally lifting to follow her as she passed. It wasn't admiration she saw in his eyes. It was recognition. And for reasons she couldn't explain, that look made her heart beat just a little faster. By the time Clara finished her set and helped Sophie clear the stage, the snow outside had thickened, coating the harbor in a soft white glow. The chatter inside the cafe had shifted to low murmurs as people buttoned coats and prepared to step back into the cold. Clara glanced toward the far corner. The man was still there. Same seat, same untouched mug of coffee. She hesitated for a moment, then slung her scarf over her shoulder and walked toward the counter to grab her own coat. By the time she turned back, the man was gone. The chair sat empty. The mug still full, leaving behind only a damp ring on the table. She might have left it at that, except when she stepped outside, she saw him again. He was moving slowly down Harbor Street, shoulders hunched against the wind, his gait uneven, as if each step cost him more than the last. At first, she thought about letting him be. He was a stranger after all. But something in the way he stopped halfway down the street, hand braced on the lamppost, head bowed, pulled her forward. "Sir," she called, her voice muffled by the snow. He didn't answer. She jogged the few steps to close the distance boots, crunching against the icy sidewalk. "Are you okay?" The man lifted his head. Up close, she could see the faint lines carved deep into his face, the gray at his temples, and eyes that looked like they'd once been bright, but had dulled from years of weathering storms no one else could see. "I'm fine," he said quietly, though his breath came heavy. "Just dizzy." Clara glanced toward the docks. "Do you live near here?" He hesitated, then nodded toward the water. "Down by Pier 9. "Let me walk you," she said before he could refuse. "It's icy, and I've got better traction in these boots than you do in whatever those are." She looked down at his worn leather shoes, the soles slick from years of use. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't have to," "I know," Clara cut in, "but I want to." They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of snow beneath them, and the distant call of a buoy bell in the harbor. She stole glances at him when she thought he wouldn't notice how his coat seemed a size too big, how his hands were red from the cold despite the gloves. When they reached the pier, the wind cut sharper, bringing with it the scent of salt and diesel. He stopped in front of a small, weather-worn shack with a single dim light burning in the window. "This is me," he said, turning to face her. "Thank you, Miss Clara," she replied. He nodded slowly as if storing the name away. "Daniel." There was a pause. Neither of them seemed in a hurry to move. Then he said, "You've got a good voice, Clara." She blinked. "You were listening, he said simply. Then, without another word, he opened the door and disappeared inside, leaving her alone on the pier, with the snow still falling around her. Clara stood there for a moment longer, the wind biting at her cheeks. Something about him, about the way he'd said her name, lingered in her chest. And she didn't know why. The next evening, the snow had slowed to a lazy drift, the kind that seemed to hang in the air before settling on rooftops and empty benches. Clara was back at Harlan's, wiping down tables after the dinner crowd thinned. Sophie was stacking chairs, humming along to whatever song was playing faintly from the old radio near the counter. The bell over the door jingled, and Clara looked up expecting another late customer. Instead, it was him, Daniel, wearing the same heavy coat and knit cap. He stepped inside, slowly stamping snow from his shoes, eyes scanning the café before they landed on her. "Evening?" she said cautiously. "Evening," he replied, moving toward a table near the window. She brought him a mug of coffee without asking, placing it in front of him. "On the house," she said. He gave a small nod of thanks, but didn't touch it right away. Instead, he pulled something from his coat pocket, a small leather-bound notebook. The corners were frayed, the leather cracked, but when he opened it, the pages were filled with neat rows of handwritten music. Clara leaned a little closer, curiosity getting the better of her. "Is that yours?" He didn't look up. "It is. You write music." A pause. "I used to." Something in the way he said it made her chest tighten. But before she could ask more, Sophie called her from across the café. Clara excused herself, but her eyes kept drifting back to him. He wasn't reading the pages like someone checking for mistakes. He was looking at them the way you might look at an old photograph, with a mixture of longing and regret. When she returned, his coffee was half gone, and the notebook was closed again. "You know," she said, trying to sound casual, "I'm singing again this weekend. If you're around, maybe you could come listen." He gave a faint, almost amused smile. "Maybe." As he stood to leave, something slipped from between the pages of his notebook, a photograph. Clara bent to pick it up before he could, but the image made her freeze. It was a black and white picture of a young woman in a long coat smiling at someone just out of frame. Clara knew that face. She'd seen it every day of her life. It was her mother. She handed it back quickly, masking her reaction. Daniel accepted it without comment, tucking it deep into the notebook, before nodding and stepping out into the snowy street. Clara stood there, the photograph still burned into her mind. A question she hadn't thought to ask before now lodged itself in her chest. Who exactly was Daniel Whitmore? The house was quiet when Clara got home that night, save for the hum of the old radiator in the hallway. A faint light spilled from the kitchen, where Margaret Emerson sat at the table, her glasses perched low on her nose as she worked a needle through a strip of deep green fabric. "Long night?" her mother asked, without looking up. Clara hung her scarf by the door. "Not too bad. Snow's letting up." Margaret nodded absently, tying off the thread. For a moment, Clara considered letting it go, just keeping the question to herself. But the image of Daniel's notebook, the photograph slipping free, refused to leave her mind. "Mom," she began, sliding into the chair across from her, "do you know someone named Daniel Whitmore?" The needle stopped mid-stitch. Margaret's head lifted just slightly, but she didn't meet her daughter's eyes. Why, Clara hesitated, then decided there was no sense in pretending. "He was at the cafe tonight. And last night, he dropped a picture of you." Margaret set the fabric down, slowly folding it into her lap. Her expression didn't change much, but the air in the kitchen shifted tenser, heavier. "Where did you say you saw him?" she asked carefully. "At Harlan's. He looks older now, but..." Clara searched her mother's face. "Who is he?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Someone I used to know, a long time ago. That's it. That's all you're going to tell me." Her mother's hands tightened on the fabric. "Some things are better left where they belong behind us." "But Mom, Clara." Margaret's tone was firm now, almost pleading. "Let it go." Clara stared at her for a long moment, trying to reconcile the guarded woman in front of her with the smiling young woman in the photograph. She wanted to press further, but something in her mother's eyes, a flicker of fear, maybe held her back. She nodded, but only outwardly. Inside, the questions multiplied. Later, lying in bed with the winter wind rattling the window, Clara stared at the ceiling. She told herself she'd respect her mother's wishes. But deep down, she knew she wouldn't. 2 days later, Clara's shift at the cafe ended early. Sophie had taken over the closing duties, shooing her out with a grin and a wave. The snow had stopped, leaving behind streets glazed with a thin sheen of ice. Instead of heading straight home, Clara wandered toward the far edge of town, where the harbor road curved inland and the buildings grew older, quieter. She passed shuttered storefronts and boarded-up shops, until she came to a corner she didn't usually take. There it was. The Windmere Grand Theater, or what was left of it. Its once bright marquee was rusted, the bulbs long gone, the letters faded to pale ghosts of themselves. Tall double doors stood chained shut, their paint peeling. Through the cracked glass, she could see rows of dusty red seats and a stage sagging under the weight of years. A notice board hung crooked near the entrance, its paper flyers yellowed and curling. One of them caught her eye, a black and white program from decades ago. She brushed the frost away to read it. Winter Gala, featuring Daniel Whitmore, pianist. Her breath caught. The picture showed a much younger Daniel, hair dark suit, pressed hands poised over a grand piano. His expression was almost unrecognizable, confident, alive, lit from within. As she stood there, a voice spoke behind her. "Haven't seen anyone looking at that in a long time." She turned to find Mr. Harlan, the cafe owner, standing with a grocery bag in one arm. "You know him?" she asked quickly. Harlan's brow furrowed. Everyone knew him. He was, well, he could make a piano sound like it had a soul. Played here every winter until... He hesitated, glancing toward the locked doors. Until one night, he didn't. What happened? Harlan shifted the bag in his arms. Not my story to tell. But I will say this, whatever drove him away, it wasn't music. Clara looked back at the program, tracing Daniel's name with her eyes. Something inside her shifted. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. There was a story here, and she needed to know it. "Does he still play?" she asked. Harlan's mouth curved in something between a smile and a sigh. "Not that I've seen. But people like him, they don't forget, even if they try." He gave her a nod and walked off down the icy street, leaving her staring through the glass at the dark stage. Clara pressed her palm against the cold window. She didn't know why, but she made herself a quiet promise right then. If Daniel Whitmore had stopped playing, she would find out why. And maybe, just maybe, she could make him start again. The next time Daniel came into the cafe, it was early afternoon, quiet enough that only 2 other tables were occupied. Clara was behind the counter, sorting through a stack of sheet music Sophie had given her as a late Christmas gift. She noticed him the moment he walked in. His steps were slow as always, but there was something different. His eyes flicked toward the stage in the back before he chose his usual seat by the window. Clara poured him a coffee and carried it over. "You've been holding out on me," she said, setting the cup down. He looked up, brow creasing. "How so?" I saw the program. "The Windmere Grand Theater, Winter Gala, Daniel Whitmore, pianist." For a split second, something almost like panic flashed across his face. Then it was gone. "That was a long time ago, not long enough for people to forget," Clara said. "Mr. Harlan told me you could make a piano sound like it had a soul." Daniel's gaze shifted to the coffee, as though the swirling steam required deep study. "I don't play anymore." Why not? He didn't answer right away. His fingers drummed once against the tabletop, a habit she guessed that came from years of keeping time. Finally, he said, "Some things. When you lose them, it's better not to go looking again." Clara leaned a little closer, or maybe they're just waiting for the right reason to be found. That made him glance up, and for the first time she thought she saw the faintest flicker of warmth in his expression. "You sing," he said. "I do." "Then you know," he murmured. "Music is more than notes. It's memory. It's dangerous." She tilted her head. Dangerous or powerful? He didn't answer, but she caught the ghost of a smile before he took a sip of coffee. The conversation might have ended there, but later when she was sweeping the floor, Daniel surprised her. He stood by the stage looking at the old upright piano tucked into the corner. "It's out of tune," he said. "Yeah," Clara replied, setting the broom aside. "No one's really played it in years." He brushed the dust from the keys and pressed one experimentally. The sound was dull flat. He tried another and another until his hands found a simple progression. Clara stood still, barely breathing. Even out of tune, the melody carried a weight, gentle, deliberate, the kind of sound that made you feel like the air in the room had shifted. After a minute, he stopped, closing the lid with a soft thud. "It's not much," he said almost to himself. "It's enough," she said quietly. He glanced at her, then back at the piano. "Bring me the tuning kit tomorrow. We'll see if it can be saved." Wasn't a promise exactly. But to Clara, it felt like the first thread of something neither of them had dared to touch in years. The following afternoon, Clara arrived at the cafe early, carrying the old piano tuning kit she'd borrowed from the high school music room. Mr. Harlan had given her a look when she asked for the key, but didn't press for details. Harlan always seemed to know more than he let on. Daniel was already there, seated at the piano, the lid open, his fingers resting on the keys, like he was reacquainting himself with an old friend. "Thought you weren't coming until later," Clara said, setting the kit on the bench beside him. He shrugged lightly. Couldn't sleep. For the next hour they worked together, Clara handing him tools, Daniel testing each note, the two of them moving in quiet rhythm. Every so often he'd play a fragment of melody to check the pitch, and Clara would find herself leaning closer just to catch the shape of it. When the last string was tuned, Daniel sat back and flexed his fingers. "Better," he murmured. Then he began to play. Not a scale, not a random exercise, but a song. It was slow, haunting, with rises that felt like questions and falls that felt like the answers you didn't want to hear. Clara didn't recognize it, but it made her chest tighten all the same. When he stopped, she asked softly, "What's it called?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I never gave it a name." That night after closing, Daniel lingered at his usual table while Clara wiped down the counter. She noticed his leather-bound notebook sitting beside his coffee. He'd stepped outside to take a phone call, though. From the tension in his shoulders, it didn't seem like a pleasant one. Curiosity tugged harder than her better judgment. She glanced toward the door and then opened the notebook. Most of it was filled with music, densely written staves notes crowding the margins. But toward the back, pressed flat between two pages, was a photograph. It was the same one she'd seen before, her mother, Margaret, younger and smiling, standing in front of the Windermere Grand Theater. Only this time, there was someone else in the frame. Daniel. They weren't just standing together. They were close. Too close for casual acquaintance. Margaret's arm was looped through his, her head tilted toward him in a way Clara had never seen in real life. Clara's pulse quickened. She turned the photo over and saw a date scrawled in faded ink, December 23, 2004, exactly 9 months before she was born. Her breath caught. The truth she'd been circling for days suddenly felt dangerously close, as if saying it out loud might change everything she knew about herself. The door creaked open, and she snapped the notebook shut just as Daniel stepped back inside. His eyes went to the table, then to her. "Ready to lock up?" he asked. Clara nodded quickly, forcing her voice to sound normal. "Yeah, ready." But as she watched him walk away into the snowy night, the weight of the photograph pressed against her thoughts, like a secret too heavy to carry alone. Christmas Eve in Windermere always carried a strange blend of quiet and anticipation. The streets glowed under strings of golden lights, the harbor lay still under a thin veil of ice, and every shop window promised warmth inside. That night, the old Windermere Grand Theater was not quite alive, but it wasn't entirely dead either. A local preservation group had managed to string a few working bulbs along the marquee, and though the main hall was still shuttered, they'd opened the smaller side stage for a holiday benefit concert. Clara had agreed to sing. She stood backstage, peeking out at the modest crowd, families in thick sweaters, fishermen still smelling faintly of the docks, a few faces from the café. Sophie caught her eye and flashed a thumbs up from the front row. The upright piano had been rolled onto the stage, freshly tuned. She hadn't seen Daniel all day, but she'd left word with Harlan inviting him to come. She wasn't sure if he would. The announcer called her name, and the applause was warm welcoming. Clara stepped into the soft glow of the stage lights, feeling the dry creak of the boards under her boots. She began with a simple carol, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. When she reached the second song, a piece she'd been practicing in secret, she hesitated. The arrangement needed a piano, and she'd planned to sing it a cappella. But then from the wings, a shadow moved. Daniel. He didn't look at her as he crossed to the piano, only settled onto the bench and placed his hands on the keys. His coat was gone, replaced by a crisp white shirt, and the years seemed to fall away from his posture as he struck the opening chord. The sound filled the small hall, rich, resonant, alive. Clara began to sing, and the music wrapped around her voice like it had been written for her. Somewhere in the second verse, their eyes met, just for a heartbeat. But in that look, Clara felt the truth settle between them, unspoken, undeniable. The final note hung in the air before the applause broke like a wave. Clara smiled at the crowd, but her gaze lingered on Daniel, who stood and gave a small bow before slipping quietly off stage. She wanted to follow him, to demand answers, to hold up the photograph and ask if what she suspected was true. But the applause kept her rooted, and by the time she made her way to the side door, he was gone, swallowed again by the snowy streets of Windermere. Windermere was quiet the morning after Christmas, the kind of quiet that made every sound, every crunch of snow, every distant gull cry feel magnified. Clara had barely slept. The image of Daniel at the piano, the way his eyes had met hers under the stage lights, had replayed in her mind all night. She found him at the pier. Daniel was sitting on an overturned crate outside his small shack, staring out at the frozen harbor. His breath rose in thin clouds. The leather-bound notebook sat on his knee, open, though he didn't seem to be reading it. "You left before I could talk to you," Clara said, stepping onto the dock. Daniel didn't look up. "You had a crowd to tend to." "I didn't care about the crowd." That made him glance at her just briefly before his eyes returned to the ice-streaked water. "What is it you want?" She took a breath, pulling the folded photograph from her coat pocket. "I want the truth." He froze. She held the picture out. Her voice wavered, but she pushed on. "This is you and my mother, 9 months before I was born." For a long moment, the only sound was the water lapping gently at the dock's edge. Then Daniel reached out, took the photograph, and looked at it, like it might burn his hands. "Yes," he said finally. His voice was low, steady, but each word felt deliberate, weighted. "That's me. And that's your mother. And that's the last winter I saw her before." Everything changed. Clara's throat tightened. "Why didn't you ever come back? Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel closed the notebook and set it beside him. "Because I thought I had no right to. Your mother made it clear she didn't want me in your life. And at the time, I was a different man. Angry, drinking too much, playing for the wrong reasons. I thought staying away was the only way to keep you safe from who I was then. You're my father," she said, the words breaking free before she could stop them. He nodded once, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I am." Clara swallowed hard, her breath clouding in the cold air. "Do you regret it, not being there?" His jaw tightened. "Every day." They sat in silence, and the gulls circling overhead, the harbor creaking under its thin sheet of ice. Finally, Daniel spoke again, softer now. When I heard you sing that first night in the cafe, I knew. Not just because of your voice. It was in the way you looked at the room, the way you held the song. That was your mother's way. And mine. Clara felt something shift inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first fragile thread of understanding. I don't know what this means, she said. Neither do I, Daniel admitted, but maybe. We can find out together. The winter wind swept between them, sharp but strangely clean. And for the first time, Clara didn't feel the cold quite so much. 2 weeks after that morning on the pier, Windermere was buried under fresh snow. The cafe was busier than usual for Saturday evening locals escaping the cold travelers stopping for warmth before heading back to the Harbor Inn. Clara was on stage adjusting the microphone when the door opened, and Daniel walked in. This time, he didn't head for his usual corner seat. Instead, he came straight to the piano. The room quieted. Even Sophie stopped mid-sentence at the counter. Daniel rested his hands on the keys, and gave Clara a small nod, an invitation. She didn't need to ask what they were playing. She knew. It was the unnamed melody he'd played during the tuning, the one that had haunted her ever since. He began the chords, rich and steady, filling every corner of the cafe. Clara's voice rose to meet the music, weaving through it like light through stained glass. The melody shifted and swelled, carrying more than just notes. It carried years of absence, of longing, of things unsaid, finally finding their voice. Halfway through, Clara glanced toward the back of the room and saw her mother standing in the doorway. Margaret's expression was unreadable at first. But as the song built, her eyes softened. When the final note faded, there was a heartbeat of silence before the applause broke. But Clara barely heard it. She turned to Daniel, breathless, the weight of the moment settling around them. Margaret stepped forward slowly, her gaze moving from Daniel to Clara and back again. For the first time in years, she addressed him directly. "You still play?" she said quietly. Daniel gave a faint smile, for the right reasons. Margaret's eyes glistened. And though no more was said, Clara felt something shift, like a door had opened just a crack, but enough for light to spill through. The rest of the night passed in a blur of music and warmth. Daniel stayed at the piano, taking requests, his fingers sure and alive. Clara sang until her voice was hoarse, and every time she looked over, he was there, present, steady, no longer just a shadow in the corner. When they stepped outside into the snowy night, the harbor lights twinkled against the dark water. Daniel handed her the leather-bound notebook. "It's yours now," he said. "Fill it with your songs." She hesitated, then tucked it under her arm. "Only if you promise to help me." He chuckled softly. "I think I can manage that." As they walked down the quiet street, their footsteps in sync, Clara realized the truth. The missing pieces of her life hadn't fallen perfectly into place. But they were finally in the same room, the same song, moving toward the same ending. And for now, that was enough. Sometimes, life's most powerful songs aren't written in studios or concert halls. They're written in the quiet corners of small-town cafes, on snowy docks, and in the hearts of people who've been apart for far too long. For Clara and Daniel, music was more than a shared gift. It was a bridge. One that carried them across years of silence, misunderstandings, and absence, and set them down on the same stage under the same light. Not every story ties up every loose end, but sometimes all we need is one song to remind us that we're not alone anymore. If this story touched you, if it made you think of someone you've been meaning to reach out to, don't wait. Make the call, play the song, knock on the door. You never know how much time you have, or how many notes you've still got left to play together. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this about love, loss, and the moments that change everything, be sure to subscribe and stay with us. Because every week, there's another song to be told. And you won't want to miss the next one.